So my personal opinion, for the record, is that I think it's way too early to say that DSLRs are going to die. Good morning everybody, I'm your host James Popsis and welcome to today's top story, which is, are DSLRs dead or are they dying? I can't remember which of those I was going to use. So I've had a stream of emails recently asking what I make of the rumours and the speculation that Nikon and Canon are soon to be releasing full-frame mirrorless cameras, and whether in fact that means the death of the DSLR, which is something that's been touted for about 10 years now and still hasn't happened. Now the truth is, I don't know. I have absolutely no idea whether this means the death of the DSLR or not, hence the suit. I thought it might make me look a bit more authoritative, although I do hate suits, so yeah, I don't really know if DSLRs are dying or not, but the plan is that I'm going to give my take in this video and then I'm going to throw it over to you in the comments and you can say what you think about the death of the DSLR. You can upvote the comments you agree with and all that kind of stuff. And then I'll have a decent resource to send people to when they email me this question, because at the moment, like I say, I just basically just say I don't know. Now, full disclosure, as many of you will know, I don't really have a horse in this race because I use mirrorless cameras. I've used this Panasonic G9 for about 6 months now. Before this, I was using a DSLR, a Nikon D750. But I've switched to this purely out of personal preference, not because of any kind of fear that DSLRs are going to die. Yeah, so it really doesn't directly affect me what happens with the future of DSLRs. But like I said, I get the question a lot, so I thought I might as well try and piece something together to be able to point people in the direction of. So, are DSLRs dead? Well, two things. Firstly, as I've already kind of alluded to, I'm not an economist or a camera industry expert, I'm a photographer, and those two things are very different. And secondly, I think the answer lies with current DSLR owners. And I think it's a case of calculating, of those DSLR owners, how many of them would consider moving to mirrorless, and what would it take for them to do so? Because there are plenty of great mirrorless cameras out there already, and they're still using DSLRs. So the question is, why is that? Is it because they don't want a new camera? Is it because they prefer using DSLRs? Is it because they don't want to change all their lenses? And I think it's only when we start getting the answers to those kind of questions that we'll start to get a sense of whether or not DSLRs are going to die or not. And I think while these new releases from Canon and Nikon might kind of give us a sense of when people are going to jump ship and if they're going to jump ship, I don't think that the release of these cameras by itself is necessarily going to kill the DSLRs, because these cameras might be rubbish, and if they're rubbish, no one's going to buy them. So I think there are three reasons why people care about this. Either they prefer shooting with DSLRs and they're worried about resale values in the future, or they like shooting with DSLRs and they're worried that in the future they're not going to be able to find a camera that they like using. Or maybe the people that prefer mirrorless want DSLRs to die so that they have more mirrorless cameras to choose from lots of different manufacturers. Or maybe people who are mirrorless shooters are just smug that they think DSLRs are going to die. I don't know. So my personal opinion, for the record, is that I think it's way too early to say that DSLRs are going to die. I mean, like I've said, I'm not an economist, but I have looked at some of the numbers. Not all of the numbers. I'm sure there are lots of numbers that I haven't seen, and I'm not entirely sure how to read all graphs properly. But from what I can make out, DSLR sales are declining fairly rapidly. And mirrorless camera sales overall seem to be kind of, I don't know, a steady line, maybe a slight increase, which, let's face it, is not a great sign for DSLRs. However, DSLR sales still dwarf mirrorless sales. There are so many more DSLR sales than there are mirrorless camera sales. So we could easily get to a point where both mirrorless sales and DSLR sales are pretty much the same and track the same in the future, in which case DSLRs obviously won't die. You know, if we've got equal groups of people who prefer mirrorless and prefer DSLRs, then clearly DSLR cameras are not going to die. But for the sake of argument, let's suggest that DSLR sales continue to just go down and down and down and down, way below mirrorless sales, even if mirrorless sales track steady. What would that do to resale values, and what would it do to the future of the DSLR? And well, in my opinion, I think it depends what end of the market you're talking about. So if you're talking about the low end, I think there's a significant difference to if you're talking about the high end. So at the low end, if DSLR sales continue to fall, I think the market will basically die, because typically people are much less invested in the lower end cameras than they are in the higher end cameras. I mean, yes, the cameras cost much less money in the first place, but also people with those cameras don't typically have 4 or 5 lenses that have cost thousands of pounds each. And my understanding, at least, is what that means is that those customers are much more mobile, are much less brand loyal. So if the sales are plummeting, then the manufacturers are much less likely to continue with those products in the hope that loyalty will bring them through the other side, because chances are it probably won't. So my advice, if you want a cheap DSLR and you're new to photography or you just don't want to spend that much money on a camera, would be to buy a second-hand one. And that's the same advice I give to people who are looking at mirrorless cameras too. If you're a beginner, if you don't shoot all that often, the chances are you're not going to get near the capabilities of a camera that's 2, 3, 4 years old, let alone a brand new one. So save your money, get a better camera for less money by buying a second-hand one. And that also means that you stand to lose less money when you try and sell it on again in 2 or 3 years' time. So that's resale values taken care of. But if you're also concerned that in the future you're not going to have a camera you like shooting with because DSLRs are going to die out, well, to be honest, it's not worth worrying about, because pretty much all low-end cameras I think are going to die out in the next 5 years, because phones are just getting better and better and better, and there's less of a market for lower-end cameras. Now at the high end, things are a little bit different. So professionals and enthusiasts are typically much more invested into one system and one brand. And that means it takes a lot more effort and much better competition for them to kind of rip up their roots and just sell all their gear and invest in another system. Which I think is why to date, Canon and Nikon have been fairly reluctant to invest in mirrorless systems, because they've been confident that people aren't going to go through the effort to invest in a system that's maybe mirrorless but quite similar in many other ways. It's got to the point now though where I think Sony is starting to not dominate the market but turn the heads of a few too many customers for Canon and Nikon's liking, so they're going to come out with a mirrorless camera. But I reckon in the short to medium term there are probably only 2 scenarios where the DSLR dies. The first is if Nikon and Canon stop making DSLRs, which I don't see happening, certainly not in the next 5 years. I mean, let's say they release flagship mirrorless cameras before the next Summer Olympics in 2020, which is typically what these manufacturers do. If those cameras don't put to bed all the concerns, literally every concern that their users and customers have about mirrorless cameras, then they're in big trouble. That's going to cost them loads of sales and loads of money, and that will probably make customers consider other manufacturers. So basically, if they ditch DSLRs while they work on their probably version 1 and maybe even version 2 mirrorless cameras, it's a huge, huge risk, because those cameras have got to be unbelievable to put to bed all the concerns that their current customer base already has. So I don't think they're going to stop making DSLRs until their mirrorless cameras are like amazing. And given that they've not released a single full-frame mirrorless camera yet, I think it's going to be a while before they nail it. The only other slightly different scenario where I see DSLRs dying anytime soon is if mirrorless cameras get to a point where they cover every single concern that a DSLR user has now. So if Nikon and Canon kept making DSLRs, but they also had a mirrorless camera which was in every way as good as a DSLR and weighed a bit less, I think chances are a lot of people might jump ship. As I said at the top of the video, I've got absolutely no data to suggest that, that's just a hunch. But I think if those companies were able to come up with a mirrorless camera that had battery life to match DSLR, that had autofocus to match a DSLR, that had EVFs which were 100% lifelike, that had incredible ergonomics in a much smaller body than a DSLR, and had build quality that could survive bombings like most professional DSLRs can, I think in that scenario, the DSLR will be in trouble. And I think mirrorless in many cases is making big, big strides. But I think from a DSLR shooter's point of view, someone that likes shooting with DSLRs, they still have more than enough reasons to stick with DSLRs rather than going to mirrorless. So my prediction for DSLRs, which is based on 0 data, 0 evidence, just my hunch, is that the lower end market is going to die, but all the lower end cameras will die, not just DSLRs. And the manufacturers potentially will move resources from the low end to the high end, and in the case of Canon and Nikon, they might use that extra resource to try and maintain a bit of a tandem DSLR mirrorless offering. Maybe they'll come up with some kind of hybrid, like a half mirror. Yeah, like I said, I've got absolutely no idea. So the bottom line, from my point of view, is if you want to buy a low-end DSLR, go for it. If you buy second-hand, you don't stand to lose much anyway. And if you're worried about cameras in the future, well, you're just going to have to deal with it then and there, because any low-end camera in the future is probably not going to be around. And if you're looking to buy at the high-end, then I'd go for it, because in my opinion, high-end DSLRs aren't going anywhere fast either. Disclaimer, it's just an opinion. I do have absolutely no idea. So before acting on my advice, I'd suggest you check down below in the comments to see what people are saying there, because there are probably people that have a much better idea of what's going to happen than I do. Thank you very much for watching. I'll be really interested to hear what your thoughts are. Until next time actually will, I promise, be the photo critiques. I've been promising that for a couple of weeks now. Thank you so much for everyone that sent their photos in. There are about 300 overall. I can't do 300 in a video, but hopefully at some stage in the future I'll get through all of them. I'll do loads and loads of critique videos. Next one will be the first one. Thank you for watching. See you later. Please leave your comments below and subscribe if you haven't already, if you thought this was interesting, or, well, it certainly wasn't informed, but see you later.